is it actually useful?
Yeah.
Potentially, I don't know. We'll see. We'll get into it because potentially I'm kind of thinking,
I presume
perhaps.
I feel like it's probably in and of itself dialectical, right? You know, like like it's a useful critique, but you know, it's a critique waiting for a synthesis to be something.
Yeah, it's waiting for people like us to come along and explain it and, really get in there and get into the intellectual muck.
Yeah, it's waiting for the proletarian revolution to come and fundamentally change the, social dynamics of society, and then we'll all think. Yeah.
And then we'll be like...
Then we'll all suddenly think dialectically.
We'll think dialectically and we'll be like, quantum gravity wasn't an issue at all, all along. We just weren't thinking about it, right?
I was thinking about Caldwell quite a lot. Well, I wasn't thinking about Caldwell. I was trying to remember what we decided we thought about that.
Yeah. We should go back to him. Yeah. The guy who who married quantum mechanics to Einstein's law of relativity. And did it easily.
I feel like what I need to do is just go back and reread all of these things that we've read, but
oh my god,
unfortunately we can't do that on the podcast, so I'm going to just find some time in my life to go back and read the Dialectical Biologist again.
Just go re-listen to our episodes. How bad could it be?
Well, I'm sure that would be fine. Not in the way that I want, I don't think.
You're like, so that's how I misread this text. Okay, interesting. I tell you what, when I was unpacking all of my shit, I kept finding books like there's like an Ellen Meekson's Wood book, an essay of which we read for the show, and I just didn't recognize it at all. I think we've talked about this episode before. It was something about class, but I was just like, don't even remember this book. Don't even remember the cover.
I remember. I might go back and read the essay because I remember when I read it, not for the podcast, I thought that I don't think I knew that I understood it, but I thought there was some material in it that excited me. And then, we weren't ready for it necessarily.
Yeah. Hey, it's a book full of essays, to be fair. Book full of short essays, so I would imagine we'll be going back to it.
Let's have another. Well, now that I've got all my books here,
on a bookshelf as well.
On a bookshelf, yeah.
Yeah, it's more than I can say.
Oh, yeah, well.
You know what I realize is because...
You just block out that window with a bookshelf,
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Actually, for the listener, because I moved over to Ireland last week and I'm waiting on my visa, so I can't work, and I can't work for like 2 months, right? Because I was at like this discussion group where people were talking about like, what is the working class? How can we define the working class? And they were like, like proletariat, like nothing to sell but their ability to work. And I was like, man, I don't even have the ability to work right now. I was like, I'm not even a pro. I was like, I literally can't even sell my labor right now, which worst places to be, but what are you gonna do? Not ideal.
No. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, government. What are you going to do? That's a problem, Dan. It's just big government. We're just not thinking about it dialectically enough. Well, you know what I should do with my unemployed time, Dan, is read essays about dialectics and be like, yes, of course. Yes, I truly do understand the dialectic. If anybody ever asks me about dialectics in the future, I'm going to be like, it took me being unemployed to finally figure out what Engels was talking about. So
also, I'm sure a really great way of ingratiating yourself into a new space is to like just learn to be incredibly pretentious about.
Yeah, exactly. I'll talk about quantum mechanics and be like, the scientists just aren't thinking dialectically enough.
Yeah. As you and I suppose, are well aware, it's perfectly easy to go around pontificating about things dialectical or non-dialecticalness without having any idea whether...
without any idea what we're talking about. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, let's get into it, Dan. I enjoyed this one. For the introduction to this one is that on our Discord, somebody was just like, I'm fed up. What the fuck is the dialectic? What does it mean when people say that? I have no clue what people are talking about when they say that, and I can't figure it out. And then I was just like, I'm going to let somebody else answer this one. And somebody in our Discord who goes by the name John Brown III, which I appreciate, basically said, you should go read this essay in this book about the philosophy of science, because one of the authors, a guy named Pierfrancesco Biasetti, basically gets into Richard Lewontin, specifically Richard Lewontin, but kind of like Lewontin and Levin's theories of dialectics that they've adapted from Engels and to a lesser extent kind of Marx as well, and how they've applied that philosophy of science. But as we'll see, like dialectics is kind of like a little bit more than just a simple philosophy of science. to biology, and that's what this essay is all about. So it's really, really good. It's relatively short, and the author writes incredibly clearly, and it's a really good way of kind of going, here's the dialectics of Engels, dialectical thinking as espoused by Engels a long time ago. Here's what he was talking about. Here's what he was on about. And here's kind of how Lewontin and Levins have kind of, not necessarily like I suppose adapted that way of thinking to biology and just adapted that way of thinking for a scientific approach in a really interesting way. And I think in a way that's slightly more convincing, maybe just because of its specificity to biology than what Engels was originally up to. And the last thing I'll say on that is that we've read chunks of Lewontin and Levin's famous book, The Dialectical Biologist, for the show before, and really enjoyed it and really found it eye-opening, but also confusing. We kind of read that book backwards because we started with Dr. Dialectics, what's his name? Jason W. Moore. And, he kind of lifts loads of his thinking from that book and from Engels as well. And so now we're kind of like finally getting around to talking about Engels and just what dialectics is, as opposed to, as we've done on every episode for the last 100, gone, two things are interacting with each other. It seems dialectical, does it not?
I like the idea that we've our entire engagement with this sort of a certain collection of literature has been entirely in reverse,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we started with Bookchin, to be fair, so I think it has been.
All right, yeah. Yeah, that was our first effort, wasn't it? Yeah. I did really enjoy this, and also like just to add to that, like there's I think there's the virtue of this, I guess, coming from a book of other essays by other authors, and also being a short essay, it's kind of like opening a lot of questions up, I suppose, or like taking a friendly but in some ways also dispassionate look at this particular effort to deploy dialectics in a modern scientific context, and like what are the successes and failures of that, or what is the worthwhileness of that, and what are the open questions that result from that going forward. So it's also quite nice to approach it as like a open effort at sort of scientific discourse, I guess, or a philosophical discourse around an approach to science. So that was quite nice as well. It's quite a nice sort of friendly way in some respects, I felt.
Yeah, and one that's like pretty practical too, because we'll get into kind of critiques of dialectical thinking, some of which I think are warranted and some of which probably aren't. And probably just like a general discussion about how actually useful something like this is. But Lewontin and Levins basically say, kind of towards the end, they basically just say that like dialectical thinking, after using dialectical thinking to solve a number of problems in biology, they come out and say that dialectical thinking actually isn't particularly good for problem solving, and you probably shouldn't just use dialectical thinking for problem solving, because then you'll be coming at it with loads of a priori assumptions, which is one of the main criticisms of dialectics, which is just like you're attempting to just lay over a framework onto nature which doesn't actually already exist. And they just basically say it's actually just a warning against metaphysics, which we'll get into kind of what that is, kind of just like bourgeois philosophy of science, which kind of gave me whiplash because that's right at the end of the essay, and it's kind of just like, wait. It's like, so is dialectical thinking as espoused by Lewontin and Levins just like a purely negative approach? It isn't, but it was just, I don't know. I thought that was kind of funny. It's like, but I want it to solve all of the problems. What's the point if it doesn't?
I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? That's the danger, is the actual desire to like have it be the mystical thing, that like be like somewhat eschatological, like, I don't know, have some degree of mysticism around the mythical deployment of the dialectic.
I love a good bit of mysticism. There's mysticism. Science, I've come away from this as like a machine god guy. Like science just seems very mystical, no matter what your philosophy, your metaphysics is. If it's dialectical, if it's purely metaphysical, it seems like there's going to be a little bit of mysticism kind of going on in your philosophy, kind of no matter what. Dialectics is an approach to kind of stamp out most of that metaphysics, or not metaphysics, mysticism, which is funny because when it's been applied, it's mainly been in a kind of mystical way, specifically in the history of the Soviet Union. But
Yeah.
we're not talking about that. So what are you gonna do? Yeah. All right. So I guess to kind of cut to the chase, dialectical thinking here is described as kind of like a threefold thing, right? Because people always want to say, what is dialectics? What does it actually mean to say that? It's described here as a description of nature, a frame for scientific research, and an explanation of our understanding of the natural world. I think this essay and a lot of the Lewontin and Levin stuff has really kind of made me realize, and talking to Viv too, like this has really made me understand why so many Marxists are interested now in systems theory, because systems theory kind of now seems like it could actually maybe replace a lot of what dialectics was trying to do in Engels's time, unless you're trying to just have it be a purely like philosophical thing. If you're actually trying to apply it to science, you'd probably be better served using something like, I don't know, second generation cybernetics or something that's a bit more kind of practical. But that's basically just to say that it was a reaction against bourgeois scientific philosophies, and specifically bourgeois like scientific metaphysics, which is very mechanistic, and an attempt to kind of understand how nature works, how it adapts, how it's constantly in motion, and attempt to understand that motion and to give it kind of a foothold that people can understand, as well as give the research of that nature its own kind of framework within which to operate, one that Engels and Levins and all these people would say is a lot more kind of true to reality than something like a mechanistic, what is it that Jason W. Moore always says? Cartesian, does he just call it Cartesian dichotomy or something like that? Cartesian dualism, something that's not that. And then, there's also the social claim, which we can get into. But, if you're listening for an answer what dialectics is, there you go. We figured it out. We solved it. It's those three things.
Yeah, the introduction to this is quite a nice. It functions as a very good introduction to the sort of history of the evolution of these ideas, or these sort of like it's sort of presenting these two tandem forms of thought. And I don't know whether like one is like fits neatly into the bourgeois capitalist category and one more into a revolutionary one per se, because they're like both streams of thought seem to come into existence not quite simultaneously, but like with the onset of the sort of modern era. You have figures on both sides of it. Obviously, like we can cast like Descartes as the arch like mechanistic thinker, I suppose. So much of his philosophy begins with the premise of imagining an entirely mechanical world. But as this essay lays out, there's quite a lot of thinkers that are challenging this very early on. Obviously, some of your big names in philosophy, Hegel and Kant, but also people in the sciences, eventually sort of culminating in Darwin, to bring it back to the sort of like biological setting of this essay, begin to challenge this view of the world, which sort of like reads it purely as a series of self-discrete categories of objects, and also reads the world and as that set of categories as being fixed and in fixed relation, and sort of like hinges its analysis on exploring the nature of singular objects, which ignores some of the fundamental categories of the development of history and the development of thought in general. It sort of ignores both the interrelation between these elements and how that interrelation and that sort of what's described in this to a certain degree as like complexity can only be brought out by having a more dialectical approach to understanding the relationship between the elements of a system. And as we were saying, like one of the fundamental elements of this sort of metaphysical approach reads the world and with a degree of fixity, and doesn't really think about how change comes about, or if it does think about change, it sort of like prioritizes the fixed and a certain degree of equilibrium as being primary, whereas the dialectical thinkers sort of flip that around and say, well, if there is equilibrium in a system, it's a rarity, it's an unlikely emergence of that system rather than its true nature, I suppose.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny. You make a really good point because it's interesting in this where the author makes the claim that, like, I suppose Engels also makes the claim that a load of scientists and philosophers around kind of the, I suppose, specifically like 19th century kind of came to a version of dialectical thinking without really realizing it. It's just kind of interesting, as you say, like Hegel and Kant, but then also Darwin, like Engels and specifically Marx kind of had their critiques of Darwin as a kind of, just placing a kind of, bourgeois worldview of capitalist society onto the natural world and the animal kingdom. But it is still interesting. They kind of make the point that, Engels and Marx are obviously trying, well, specifically Engels is trying to make the point that this is like the next step, right, in a metaphysics. This is the next step in scientific thinking. And at a certain point, we're going to run up against a wall where this kind of mechanistic bourgeois metaphysics can't really explain things. And, we were joking about it at the beginning of the show, but this was kind of the whole point when we read the Christopher Caldwell essay, where he was kind of like, there's a crisis in physics because there's a crisis in every other aspect of bourgeois society. And it's for the same reason. And you can kind of jokingly like sum it up as people just aren't being dialectical in their thinking enough and not being dialectical in their scientific approach to the world, right? But I also think you are right to kind of outline the difference between what they call just pure metaphysics, which I'm kind of, I don't know, just the word metaphysics, I feel like maybe you need to be a bit more specific just because it's like, is dialectical thinking not a version of metaphysics? I suppose they'd say probably not, but yeah.
I don't know. I was quite confused by this because to a degree, this is cast as like the arch dichotomy, and the essay ends by asserting that Lewontin and Levenstein, like, one of their core principles is upholding that distinction strongly and saying that it's one or other, and to some degrees not both or not neither kind of thing. Either you're a metaphysical thinker or you're a dialectical thinker. But there is a point in this essay where the author describes dialectics as a form of metaphysics in some ways. Like what's being sorry. I barely know how to pronounce either of the names, and I keep forgetting which one is the one that's being the topic of this. Yeah. So yeah, what Lewontin is proposing is the necessity to deploy dialectics as your sort of metaphysical principle, I guess. Yeah, and then also like as a follow up from that to then say, well, okay, a sort of theory of knowledge, our approach to analyzing and developing our understanding of the world has to then deploy a sort of like dialectical methodology in our searching for understanding, in this case in science, like, yeah. So it's kind of like a dialectical metaphysics and also, but then a sort of a dialectical approach to epistemology, whereas like developing our understanding has to have a dialectical methodology, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, it just seems like what they stand, all of these people, the author of this, Lewontin, Engels, all kind of seem to be criticizing is just a bourgeois worldview, which sometimes is called metaphysics and sometimes is called like mechanistic science. And I suppose it just depends on how you define the word metaphysics, because if a metaphysics is something like a philosophy of science, which, I don't know, I guess you could use the word like that, then yeah, dialectics you would seem to be, unless you wanted to be like, but it encompasses more, which I suppose it does, but also anyway, I don't want to get into that too much, but just to say that like when we say metaphysics, we're referring to this kind of like bourgeois worldview, the kind of arch example of which is Darwin's theory of evolution. While there were some kind of like dialectical elements to that, Darwin obviously was very clearly taking some values of the society that he lived in and just applying them to his scientific research without kind of questioning them and questioning where those assumptions came from, survival of the fittest, these kind of things. And you're right. The main kind of difference between that kind of metaphysics and dialectics is that the metaphysical way of thinking is very, it's very static. it kind of focuses in on the one thing that you're trying to study, and it kind of alienates it and isolates it from its either environment or just its relations to any other thing. And it's really rooted in dichotomy, as we kind of saw in the Jason W. Moore book. And I really like the explanation that it's just rooted in common sense. Common sense is a big bourgeois thing, obviously. Talk about Thomas Paine or somebody like that, but it's like, what? It's just common sense. Of course, if you're studying like a cat, you need to study the cat, and you what determines the cat? It's genes. That's it, and the environment. Don't worry about it. Whereas the kind of like dialectical way of thinking about things is hugely reminiscent of what would become systems theory, because it's really interested in the relations between things, in kind of the ways in which they interact and the ways in which they influence each other. It's would never kind of make the mistake of purely talking about the subject and the object of one specific area of study, because it recognizes that depending on what standpoint you're talking about, the environment can be the subject and the organism can be the object, or that can be reversed. And it basically looks at things as they're constantly in motion, as they're interacting with everything around them. And it's very universal. And the main thing is that you can kind of just never explain anything without its context, which kind of these all do kind of seem to be tenets of systems theory. And I never particularly understood when Marxists would say, why it is, because I've heard it said before that by some Marxists that like, is dialectics kind of just outdated because now we have systems theory? Now we actually have a criteria for describing these relationships in these systems in a kind of recursive, all-encompassing, universal way that we didn't back in Engels' time. And this kind of made me realize, it's basically because dialectics is kind of just almost a proto-systems theory in a really interesting way. I mean, obviously, there are all different types of systems theory. There's like managerial stuff, which is obviously the most bourgeois mechanistic stuff on the planet. But then there's somebody like Stafford Beer, who I don't actually know how much he engaged with these ideas, but seems to kind of have just stumbled across a really similar way of thinking. And, again, just the last thing I'll say is that really gives credence to when we spoke to June Reith of General Intellect Unit. She was just basically like, I think if Marx and Engels were alive now, this is just what they'd be interested in. It's all they'd be reading about, right? Specifically, probably Engels, because, he's trying to basically just describe the cybernetic stuff that we've read. Hey, him and Stafford Beer, they talk about their beards and they talk about systems. That's what they talk about. And they probably drink a lot of weird wine.
Yeah, shit over a port or something.
Yeah, a bottle of port.
A nice dinner and a bottle of port, yeah. I don't know. I really appreciate your phrase or your setting the scene for this essay in that way, I suppose, because I guess as we'll go on to discuss later, like this essay sort of ends with discussing the broad criticism style of dialectical thinking, the sort of dialectical approach, how it probably doesn't represent in the way some people want it to a fully worked out actual approach to how to guide a scientific approach to understanding the world and analyzing it. And it sort of casts it as more of like a theoretical schema or a set of terminology, in some ways a schema for criticizing both the work of other people and sort of assessing your own work, I suppose, in the same way to avoid certain pitfalls or mistakes. But the idea that systems theory might be the sort of like the ending you could add on to this essay to say, okay, well, no, but maybe not dialectics, but the natural outgrowth of that is systems theory. I mean, the other interesting thing, I suppose, is that like to recognize that the content of this essay and Lewontin's and Lewontin's work is around biology, because they are biologists and they're trying to apply dialectics to biology, but then to recognize the counter movement backwards and say, to look at how heavily influenced systems theory is by biological terminology and biological thinking. It's only when you talked about the organism and its environment, you could look at this essay and look at strict understandings of biology and evolution and species divergence and whatever. You could take that terminology and apply it very strictly to a biological setting, but you could also take the terminology of the organism and its environment and see it more broadly as, okay, the organism is a person vis-a-vis its environment, but also an organization or a workplace or some subcategory, any subcategory that has some solidity operating in relation to an exterior environment. So it's in some ways it's very useful to be discussing. It's not a limitation of this is a even though this essay is focused on the world of biology and the debates, the academic debates therein, there is a broader advantage to it being cast in that way or being analysed in that setting, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny because you saying that is making me think about like the actual applications of this, which I just hadn't thought about at all. But yeah, it's interesting to kind of think about how this could be applied if dialectics is as universal as it claims to be, if systems theory is as universal as it claims to be, like how this could be applied to like actual human systems. It seems like Engels was very like reticent to actually apply a lot of this stuff to human systems in a way that I was really surprised by. I was like, it seems like he would have just been, because I don't know, like when Marx is writing about, well, I suppose just like in Capital, a lot of his writings, it seems to be very influenced by a kind of proto-systems theory, a kind of like dialectics, right? And it's just kind of like when he's describing these human social systems, it's kind of like, well, why wouldn't you take that next step and try and actually apply it? Maybe it was just like a kind of like and maybe Engels just felt like he was a bit out of his depth or something like that. But it seems like that would be the first place I apply these to. Like he just seemed really reticent to kind of apply ideas of the quote unquote natural world to human society in a way that feels, I almost said speciesist, but that's just because I just unpacked my Earth First zines. I think maybe not speciesist, but like, I don't know, privileging human society as something that is not of the natural world. You know, I mean, I guess this is just a question in broader systems theory. It's like, okay, you can describe a management of a firm like this. You can describe an ecosystem like this. Can you describe sociology like this? Of which people have different answers to, but it seems like, I don't know. Yeah, why not? I don't know. It's all systems, dude. You know what I mean?
Why not?
Why not? The stuff in... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was just going to bring up this idea of like bad metaphors, like scientific analysis, picking a metaphor to try and be useful in explaining whatever it is it's trying to explain, and then there being a degree to which that metaphor then becomes sort of all dominant to the point where it really structures our thinking. And I guess it's worth bringing up the point when it comes up in this essay, because it's one of the few points where it sort of almost overlaps with history and the evolution of society and almost the revolution in modes of production. Sort of historical. It's the only moment where there's a degree of historical materialism that comes through when he's talking about these various dominant metaphors that exist at certain periods of time. So the one that the author of this talks about is the transition between like a body metaphor and a machine metaphor. Like there's a degree to which I think what's being implied, if not said directly, is that like under feudalism or some pre-capitalist mode of production, the metaphor that was predominant in scientific and proto-scientific discussions of biology and other sort of social systems was like a metaphor of the body where everything is connected and there's a certain indivisibility between elements. And I could see why that might have some overlap with how the mode of production functioned and how people existed in a very specific place, in a very fixed relation to other people within the mode of production. And the author of this talks about the sort of the predominance of a machine metaphor in sort of like capitalist understanding of science and the body, and relational systems, I suppose, between organisms and between individual elements, suggesting that what it's privileging is the individual elements of the machine, understanding organisms as a machine and as individual operators. Now, there's a degree to which, to me, it feels like you could read both of those metaphors. That it's only those metaphors only have those connotations, I suppose, because we're so used to thinking of a body as being like a relational thing where none of the elements could exist separated from the other elements, they would lose their meaning. There's a way you could look at a machine and say, well, its elements wouldn't continue to exist in the same way if it was removed from that. So for me, the sort of like the strong claim that there is a real distinction between these two metaphors doesn't hold weight, I guess, but like it's a useful way of sort of identifying how the social system and the mode of production can come to dominate social thinking and influence scientific thinking in a way that people might not recognize. It's common sense.
Yeah, I absolutely. Because when I was first going through this, I was like, because the author makes a point where it's like science has to revert to metaphors because it is explaining by its very nature things that can't be experienced directly. So you have to resort to metaphors. I was like, does science do that? Is science constantly reverting to a metaphor? And then I kind of got thinking about what the author claims is this kind of modern metaphor of science, which is, as you say, the machine. And I was just kind of like, oh yeah, I guess I just took that for granted that was just the modern claim of science, that everything has its place. And I think you're right, because I struggle with this distinction between the pre-modern view metaphor of science as the body and kind of the modern philosophy of science metaphor of the machine, mainly because I think what the body metaphor seems to be implying almost is a kind of like mysticism surrounding and motive force that everything is kind of controlled by. It's like everything is part of God's plan is kind of the way of talking about it, right? And like, the thing that's kind of holding me up on saying how different that is to the machine is kind of because that kind of mysticism, while it's not, as obvious, kind of is still there, right? Like, I don't know. I suppose the kind of great example would be like Newton talking about, discovering gravity or whatever. But then being like, it's just some weird force. Nobody knows how it works. That's God. Right. But it's like, I don't know, that kind of thing that kind of mysticism is almost fairly common like now. And to the author's credit, they make the point that like that mysticism might come from this idea of everything being in its right place in the machine, right, of modern science. And I think that's maybe the thing that is actually distinct between the body and the machine, is that like everything is in its right place and can be studied as such. And you just build up on different levels, right? Where it's like you study chemistry to understand biology, to understand, ecosystems, and just up and up from there. Like, because I don't know, that kind of like emergent way of thinking seems to also just imply a bit of a like mystical motive force to me. I don't really know how to explain it. It's just kind of like the idea that everything is in its right place. And if you just study the individual parts of a greater system, then you can understand the system of a whole, implies purpose. And it also implies a kind of trust in like Laplace's calculator, right? Where it's like, look, you just study this one bit and then you can completely predict everything else in the future, right? You can completely predict the rest of the machine. If you study, the genes of an organism, you can understand the organism itself. You can understand the environment. If you study, I don't know, the chemistry of something, you'll be able to understand. I don't want to continue because I'll just sound like an idiot. But like that kind of mysticism that is present in the body metaphor to me is just clearly present in the machine metaphor too. It's just a kind of like rational trust in this motive force that otherwise I respected a lot more in the body metaphor, because they were just like, I don't know. Newton's just like, I don't know what gravity is. It's God. We can't figure it out. It's God. How do large bodies influence each other? It's God. Don't worry about it. But now it's like, it's this trust in rationality that is, as I say, very reminiscent to me of something like Laplace's calculator or Laplace's demon, where it's just like, everything's got a purpose, man. Everything makes sense and it's all in its place. Hopefully that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, like, in some ways that brings us into the critique of mainstream biological thinking as it's like outlined in this essay, and as it's outlined by in that one of the things that's being criticized here, and being criticized by people who are advocating a more dialectical approach to a biological understanding of biology is to say, well, like, so it's so much of contemporary understanding of evolution is applying a very sort of like deterministic understanding of how things come about. Like, traits of biological organisms are purely a result of one gene expressing themselves. Like, the outcome is determined by a very fixed set of steps that stem from the nature of a particular gene, you know, or like the onward evolution of an organism into the future is all almost sort of contained the in the very first moment of, you know, the conception of life on Earth or something. You know, like, it's very there's a teleological approach to the metaphysical understanding of biology that's being criticized by the dialecticians, I guess. There is a reference made to like the sort of insertion of a presumption of a religious creator, I suppose, but it's given or that the author of this presents that religious logic as appearing in a different form, in the form of the idea of a environmental niche that creatures, biological organisms, fulfill in an environment, you know. And there is a contradiction that they attempt to identify, which I'm not sure whether I fully understand or can quite work through. But this contradiction between sort of problems and solutions, and a solution to an evolutionary problem, I suppose, for the metaphysical way of thinking, it's almost this. There's almost a degree to which the solution precedes the problem ever coming around, which the author of this presents as not really being a problem for people if you're willing to just sort of set God as the original trigger for things. But like, in a secular world, like, you can't you have to you have to fall back on there being a contradiction there, or accept that you can't have solved a problem before it's been discovered, I suppose. Yeah, what's necessarily meant by that, or what the implications of that were, I wasn't very clear. But yeah, it is sort of like there's an effort to work it out to some degree.
There is something so funny because Dawkins gets criticized loads as kind of just being like the arch, you know, like gene determinist, kind of like vulgar Darwinist in this. And there's something so funny about Lewontin being like to Dawkins, like, no, sir, it is in fact you that believes in God.
Yeah.
So funny. You are being irrational. Also, all-time pivot for Dawkins to like, as soon as people started questioning like his contributions to like evolutionary biology, to just pivot into like, well, people who believe in God are stupid. It's so funny. Good for him. You know what I mean? Good for him. Wonder what that guy's up to these days. Yeah, there's a footnote in here that I kind of want to read, which is a quote from the Lewontin and Levin's book, basically describing why it is that, kind of like in a roundabout way, it's kind of describing why it is that they as biologists are so interested in dialectics and why they think it's so useful to their field of science, as opposed, maybe not opposed, but like more so, and is more urgently needed than in other, scientific fields. So Biasetti says that Lewontin compares the progresses of mechanistic science to the strategy of medieval armies. Quote, cities are laid siege to, and most surrender, but a few hold out indefinitely. The army sweeps around these, leaving behind some of its troops, who settle down to a long and frustrating encirclement. This has certainly been the case in biology, where extraordinary progress was made in molecular studies, where the extraordinary progress made in molecular studies has been the consequence of a straightforward reductionist program, while the understanding of embryonic development and of the functioning of the central nervous system have remained in a rudimentary state. So what they're basically saying is, their point isn't that mechanistic science is just doomed to failure. In fact, they're saying it's been responsible for massive leaps in human understanding, but kind of that sociological claim that dialectical thinking puts forward, which is, you know, not only that science isn't neutral, but that scientists kind of transpose their values from society into their work. also you can take that one step further by basically saying that science advances not only due to better observation, they're saying, but also due to societal transformation, right? So if you take that kind of first idea, which is that scientists, impart the values of the society, the mode of production, we might say, that they exist within onto their work, perhaps when we're all living in a socialist utopia, dialectical thinking, when that becomes the norm, you would see a massive uptick in scientific advancement in these specific pockets of science that dialectical thinking, or that mechanistic science, has been unable to really fully kind of get past its own crisis. And this is exactly what Caldwell was talking about when he talked about the crisis in physics. And it's really interesting that biology is one of these things where you actually do probably have to take, I think rightfully so, some of the ideas of dialectical thinking to really fully understand what's going on in evolution and in, as they say, like embryonic development, stuff like that. Because, if you just take the Dawkins vulgar Darwinist idea of all phenotypes are just purely determined by their genes, well, that doesn't really make any sense at a certain point. It'll get you to a certain level, but it won't really get you past, like, well, how does a phenotype actually develop in complete isolation from its environment, right? Or from the kind of behavioral differences in learned behavioral differences of an organism, something like that. They would just be meaningless and be kind of hanging in the void. So I thought that was really interesting. It's a really mature take on science or the philosophy of science, to kind of say, mechanistic thinking has been hugely helpful in certain areas, some more than others. Kind of, in most ways, it's certainly an advance from what the authors would call the body metaphor. But at a certain point, if we truly do want to understand quantum gravity, then we would just be dialecticians and just go, it's not actually that, it's not a problem. Don't worry about it. It's not a problem.
Just wait for the revolution. The proletariat will fix it all.
Yeah, exactly. It's the proletarian science dialectics. That's what it is.
It's nice to hear them making that argument. Like I don't know, with the same kind of, well, it's not necessarily with the same kind of fervor that Caldwell will have done, but like that there is that sort of sense of social evolution and social revolution underpinning their understanding of what science is and how you approach greater scientific understanding, or how we're held back from greater scientific understanding, I suppose. So yeah, appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Big help. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Maybe we should just talk a little bit about the critiques of dialectical thinking. I mean, the two main critiques are that it's just really obscure and that it maybe doesn't actually mean anything at all when you try to practice it. Yeah, exactly. Well, that's how you just hand wave away quantum mechanics. Don't worry about it.
No Big Bang,
Yeah, that was so funny. I love that. There's a whole footnote in here dedicated to Engels being like, it's undialectical. And yeah, so that it's obscure, that's the main critique. And then also that it brings with it a set of assumptions, that a priori assumptions to problems or to scientific studies that aren't warranted. Now, I mean, the obvious rebuttal to that last one is that scientists, capitalist bourgeois scientists, like, claim that they don't have a metaphysics, but in so doing, they just fall prey to a bad metaphysics. Like, they claim they don't have a philosophy when they study their science, that they're being purely rational and not influenced by anything. But that's just in itself a metaphysics and bad philosophy, right? So it's like, it isn't so much a question of, are you bringing a priori assumptions to your research? Dialectical thinking would probably just say, you definitely are. What are those and where are they coming from? And how does that, like, influence your research? Which, fair enough. Don't pretend the problem doesn't exist.
It's like, I mean, where this, I guess that the thing that was interesting for me about this was like the on a zoomed in level, I don't necessarily understand, but on a sort of like a higher level, I can sort of take away, is this idea that, like, what's being said here is that, like, there have been, like, discoveries made that, like, operate under systems that run parallel to a dialectical process without necessarily having to take on all of these sort of, like, assumptions. So this is coming back to some of the things we were alluding to at the start, right? Which is that, like, is it the case that this is simply a sort of, like, schema that you can lay over something and sort of, like, as a way to developing an understanding. But as you were pointing out, there's perfectly many discoveries that it's possible to make using the metaphor, sort of the mechanistic or understanding, or what they've been talking about as being like a sort of like metaphysical approach to understanding the natural world. But also the author of this is making the point that like there are other schools of thought which like cleave closely with the discoveries made by purely dialectical thinkers, but for one reason or other don't like accept the entire sort of heuristic of understanding, I guess. I don't know where that leaves us really in terms of like knowing whether what purpose dialectics serves for us, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like of the three claims, the kind of like metaphysical, the epistemological, and the sociological claim, the sociological claim holds up the most. And I think that that's actually maybe the one that most scientists have an issue with, or that most philosophers have an issue with, because it kind of, along with it, you have to accept that modes of production exist and that we do actually live in one, and that it is actually based on not pure rationality, but exploitation and, you know, exchange over everything, including a purely rational science, right? Like, you know, you don't get to study what you want, right? You got to study what the Department of Defense decides it needs. You know, I was talking with a friend of mine, and her partner is studying, I won't get into exactly what it is, but they're basically studying something that for them in chemistry started out as just like a purely interested research project in something that has applications in many, many different fields, but they're getting their funding for further research from a company that purely has interest in it being used for like bulletproofing and like the military. And it's just like, oh, that's a shame. Damn, that's a shame. That could have been used for something else, but you know, what are you going to do? And, you know, I bring that up just because, you know, I think anyone that actually studies science, of which I do not, or at least, you know, actively is engaging in science, scientific study, like they should be able to tell you that much at least. But I think that the like larger overarching sociological claim that then not only influences the work that you do, but then also like the way that you interpret your work and the metaphor that you're using, and how in a weird roundabout way that metaphor actually becomes your work and influences the work itself, which is itself kind of dialectical, is just maybe something that people have an issue with. So in terms of its usefulness, like, yeah, the sociological claim I think is hugely useful. The epistemological claim, which is that scientists can really only understand nature by doing dialectical thinking, I'm quite open to, just in terms of using dialectics as a guide and maybe actually kind of expanding on it a little bit more into something like a systems theory. But the metaphysical claim, which is that all of nature has a dialectical structure, I'm a little bit like, maybe it depends on if dialectics is like, I don't know, as broadly defined as a non, you know, Cartesian systems theory, then maybe, yeah. But other than that, I'm kind of like, maybe that's true. Is everything the contradict, the negation of the negation? Also, why is it not D-Cartesian? Why is it just Cartesian? That has always bothered me. But that's a conversation for another time.
Well, because like D-Cartesian would sound like it's non-Cartesian, right?
True. Yeah. We're D-Cartesian.
Descartesian? I don't know.
Descartesian. Anyway.
I mean, at a certain point, it sort of feels like when you get to that metaphysical level, it really doesn't matter. You're in the realms of philosophy at that point. Like, does that have a practical application? Does it need to? Does it matter? The way you describe it there, the way this describes it, maybe not so much, you know.
Yeah. If this type of thinking becomes the norm in a natural way after we get past capitalism, then I'll be like, okay, in hindsight, sure, nature has a dialectical structure. Yeah. But, you know, until then, I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. Is this a stupid thing to say? Maybe obviously socialism is a mode of production as well. Seems like that would also influence the way you think about things and the way that you study society. Dialectics seems like it, if Engels and Marx were correct, seems like that would be the way that people think. But does that not come with its own pitfalls? Maybe we need to be a bit more mechanistic, is what I'm saying. And socialists, what are you going to do? I do love the idea, though, that like as soon as a revolution comes, there's just an explosion of scientific like understanding and of research, and which probably could happen, but I feel like that would maybe have more to do with people just being able to study what they're interested in and get funding for whatever, as opposed to
having the time
being
and not
like
having to work on making Kevlar or new forms of
yeah,
Kevlar.
exactly, literally, yeah. Yeah. They kind of end this on an interesting note where it seems like Lewontin is trying to push back a little bit on the idea of dialectics just being systems theory in a way where he just kind of says that you can't purely think about the relationship between, in biology, like gene, organism, environment, trichotomy, I guess, as purely a question of feedback. And I was kind of interested in that because it's like, obviously the word feedback and the concept of feedback is really present in all versions of systems theory. And it made me think maybe Lewontin was just kind of like, maybe he understood or understands feedback in a very Cartesian kind of way, where it's like this thing affects this thing in this way, and then that thing affects this thing in this way. And I guess he's just saying that's not dialectical enough. But at the end of the day, it seems like you could use the vocabulary of feedback in something like a dialectical way. I kind of didn't fully understand that. And I didn't fully really understand why feedback is also bad, because feedback exists. Maybe you would just call it something else. I didn't understand that.
I mean, yeah, I think it's one of the things that I understood to be a potential criticism of dialectics was like almost an inability to see any relationship from the standpoint of only one element in that relationship. You're always compelled to remember that everything is a relational interaction, I suppose, that contains contradiction, that contains the constant process of both things in a relationship being subject and object at the same time. And it seems like for Lewontin, like any other way of looking at it is bad somehow. It's metaphysical and non-dialectical. Whereas it seems like that's generally probably quite a useful way of studying something, is to study something purely as subject in relation to an environment, so maybe it's just for him that like feedback just strays. It allows for too much of a prioritizing of one side of a dialectical relationship over the other. It was I enjoyed seeing the terminology of feedback discussed there, because as you say, it does draw in this connotation of systems theory and I guess an alternative understanding of seeing the world relationally rather than just purely focused on the sort of singular static object in relation to its environment that it has no influence over, or nor does the environment have any influence over it, I suppose.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That was my
It is just Jason W. Moore being like, Cartesian, wrong. Yeah. You don't agree with me. Cartesian. And the only other thing I guess I was just thinking of is that I was surprised, and also I quite enjoyed the idea that dialectical thinking is very much an unfinished project. I think we're still probably getting out of the kind of stupid bullshit of people being like, dialectics? Do you mean like Stalinist diamat? Or do you mean like whatever Mao was talking about? Like, we're still kind of getting out of that dogmatism, and to actually go back to really understand what Engels was talking about, and to not only understand that, but then to also understand the shortcomings and just like practically he never finished what he wanted to talk about in terms of dialectical thinking. Like, I really found it refreshing. And I think I probably do kind of wind up agreeing with Lewontin and Levins in terms of dialectical thinking isn't an approach to problem solving so much as a way of, I don't know, like guiding thinking. I don't like thinking about it as purely something that's just negative in terms of its relationship to bourgeois metaphysics, but because I think that there obviously are hugely positive contributions to the philosophy of science in dialectical thinking. But I'm kind of comforted to know that it remains unfinished and that maybe its mantle has been carried on, in a similar way that Kant and Darwin unknowingly were being a little bit dialectical. It's being kind of carried on, its research, in something like kind of more progressive systems theory. So dialectics, I'm on board, and I'm going to try to be a bit better when I just randomly call things dialectical because they're in a relationship. Hopefully now we know a little bit more about what that actually is.
And I think also like using the schema of biology to understand dialectics more broadly seems, for me, it's quite a fruitful one, I suppose. I don't necessarily know why that is. Maybe it's because of the parallels to the language of systems theory. I don't know, but like, I feel like I have a better understanding of what it means to. Well, it's. I feel like I'm in a position to take on board that sort of like that negative analysis of like, always remember, like it's a matter of a relationship, and sometimes something's an object, and sometimes it's the subject, and both elements in an interaction are both of those things, and like, I think it's worthwhile remembering that, but. How I'm going to be positively dialectical, I don't really know.
Positively dialectical. Yeah. Well, it's all good stuff. It's also funny when, like, I don't know, the feedback stuff and all of that. I was just thinking this. It's like, you still have to do science. You know what I mean? You still have to do it. And to kind of, to speak to what you're saying, it's like, I think, there definitely seems to be a reason that the two most, the two standout dialectical thinkers of our time, of the past 20, 30 years, however long they've been writing, Lewontin and Levins, are biologists, and specifically evolutionary biologists, because I think, like, what you're saying is, it's true. It's like biology and evolutionary biology are both very ripe for a dialectical worldview. Good luck to, like, the physicist that wants to, be dialectical, I guess. It seems like they're, as kind of Lewontin was saying earlier in that quote I read, like, it seems like there are branches of science where it would be a lot harder to do this. So yeah, good luck to them. Good luck to the people making Kevlar, I guess. Try to be more dialectical in the way that you're thinking.
Good luck to the physicists. Yeah.
Good luck to the physicist. Read more Codwell. It's just not a problem. Don't worry about it. All right. Well, we're seasoned dialecticians now. Thank you very much, Dan. This was very, very good. I enjoyed it.
Thanks for the recommendation of this essay as well.
Yes, absolutely. Just again to say, if anybody does have any more recommendations, send them our way, because this is our 130th episode. So send them our way.
We've got big plans for next week. I think it's going to be good.
Plans, big plans. Quite literally, physically big plans. So, yeah, thank God I'm unemployed. That's what I'll say. All right. See you later, Dan. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Hey, everybody. Jack here. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. The song that you heard on this episode is Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. You can go ahead and check this song out much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. If you want to go ahead and get in touch with us, chat shit, tell us that we're wrong, whatever you want to do, you can go ahead and do that at auxiliarystatements@gmail.com. You can just send us a message there. Or you can get in touch with us on Twitter, on Discord, on Instagram. You're a smart person. You can find these places. We got a YouTube. We post stuff there as well. Sometimes we stream. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time.